1959. The Ural Mountains. At -30 degrees, a group of experienced hikers cut their way out of their own tent from the inside and ran out barefoot into the night, into a snowstorm. They were escaping, but something doesn't make sense. They didn't run, they walked slowly down the mountain, and none of them survived. That night, the tent was not torn from the outside, but from within. And when you try to imagine that moment, it only becomes more disturbing. Inside that tent, they saw something or felt something, and in a single instant, they made a decision. They ran out without shoes, without coats, into that freezing darkness. This was not a mistake. It looked like an immediate reaction. So, what was it that terrified them that much? (1959), the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. A group of young hikers set out with a clear goal. They were not amateurs. They were experienced. They were trained. They knew the cold. They knew the mountains. The leader of the expedition was Igor Dyatlov, calm, capable, respected. Originally, there were 10 members, but just before the journey began, one of them turned back due to health issues. That decision would later make him the only survivor. Looking back, that moment feels like a strange turning point. Same plan, same beginning. But one decision separates survival from disappearance. The remaining 9 continued the expedition as planned. They took photos. They wrote in their journals. They documented everything. In those photos, they are smiling, laughing, playing around. They look like any normal group on an adventure. And that is what makes it unsettling, because those images do not look like the beginning of a tragedy. They look like ordinary young people enjoying their day, and no one in those photos had any idea what would happen just days later. The group continued moving, and eventually they reached the place where they would set up their final camp. The name of that place was Kholat Syakhl. In the language of the local Mansi people, it means the mountain of the dead. This name was not given after the incident. It already existed for a long time. Hunters in the region were said to avoid the area. There was no clear explanation, but even then it was not considered a welcoming place. Of course, a name alone does not explain what happened, but once you know the story and you hear that name again, it feels different, unsettling, almost too fitting. It may sound like a coincidence, but when people look back, they tend to see patterns. And in this case, there are too many things that seem to align in strange ways. Experienced hikers choosing to camp on a mountain known as the Mountain of the Dead. Was it just coincidence? Or were they somehow led there? The expedition was proceeding as planned until the weather changed, the wind grew stronger, a snowstorm began, visibility dropped, orientation became difficult. In a whiteout, even the difference between up and down can disappear. Instead of reaching their original destination, they set up camp on a slope. It was not necessarily a wrong decision. In that situation, staying put might have seemed like the safest option. Their choice was likely not driven by fear, but by calculation. Moving further could mean getting lost. Staying could mean survival. But in the end, that decision became their last. Why did they stay there? Why didn't they move further down? These are not simple questions, because the answer may be the key to everything that followed, and to this day, no one has been able to answer them. Days later, a search operation begins, and what they find first is the tent, partially buried in snow, still standing. But something is wrong. The tent was not torn from the outside. It was cut open from the inside. This is one of the most important details in the entire case. If something had attacked from outside, they would have used the entrance, but they didn't. They cut their way out, quickly, desperately, as if there was no time to even reach the door. In that moment, finding the exit was less important than getting out immediately. Inside the tent, their shoes were still there. Their coats were still there. Everything they would have needed to survive outside remained behind. This means they did not leave prepared. They fled. This was not a planned action. It was a reaction. Not a decision made through reasoning, but something closer to instinct. And when you try to imagine that moment, it becomes even more disturbing. Night. Snowstorm. Inside the tent. Were they asleep? Or had they already sensed something? Did someone say, "We need to get out now"? And that single sentence triggered everything. Why did they have to leave that urgently? It looks like they didn't even have time to think. Outside the tent, there were footprints in the snow. They clearly belonged to the group, but something was wrong. They were not boot prints. They were barefoot, or made with socks. Some even appeared to be in underwear. At -30 degrees, they had left the tent without proper gear and walked down the mountain, as if they were escaping. But here's the strange part. They did not run. If people are truly panicking, their movements become chaotic. They stumble, they fall, their tracks become scattered. But these footprints were organized, consistent. They moved in the same direction, slowly, almost calmly, as if they were afraid, but not completely out of control, as if they were escaping something while still thinking. So what did they see that made them leave like that? The first body was found near the forest, barefoot, wearing only underwear, frozen. But that was only the beginning. Other bodies were found later deeper in the area, and their condition became more disturbing. Some had broken ribs, others had severe skull damage, but on the outside, there were almost no visible injuries. This is not typical of a normal accident. It looked as if the force had come from within, as if something invisible had struck them from the inside. Then there was another detail. The skin of the bodies was not normal. Reports described it as orange or dark yellow, not the kind of color you would expect from exposure to cold alone. It was unnatural. And then there was something even more disturbing. One of the female victims was missing her tongue. Her eyes, her lips, and parts of soft tissue were also gone. This was not something that could be easily explained. Was it the environment? Animals? Or had something else happened before they died? Even now there is no clear answer. And that is what makes it even more disturbing. Another strange detail is where the bodies were found. They were not all in one place. Some were discovered early, others days later in deeper parts of the forest. It looked as if they had moved in different directions, or had been forced to separate. But their movement was not completely random. Some were found near signs of a fire, others under trees. Each position looked intentional, not chaotic, not purely desperate. It seemed like they were trying to survive, trying to endure. Which raises another question. Were they simply running away, or were they trying to stay alive while something was still out there? As the investigation continued, another strange detail emerged. Some of the clothing showed abnormal levels of radiation, levels that are not normally found in nature. This was not something expected in a mountain accident. There is no reason for radiation to be present in such a situation. But it was there, and it was not minimal. It was significant enough to raise questions. Why was there radiation on their clothes? Where had they been? What had they come into contact with? No one could explain it. Around the time of the incident, people in nearby areas reported strange sightings. Lights in the sky, floating spheres, moving objects that did not behave like normal aircraft. They moved slowly, then suddenly changed direction, disappeared, reappeared. Witnesses described them as glowing, silent, and unnatural. Some believe that what the hikers experienced was not a natural event, but something else. Whether these lights were connected to the incident has never been confirmed, but the timing is difficult to ignore. After the incident, the Soviet authorities began their investigation. But as time passed, something changed. Information started to disappear. Reports were limited. Only partial details were made public. The area itself was eventually restricted, closed off, and some records were never seen again. This is where questions began to grow. Was this really just an accident, or was there something more? Some began to suspect military involvement, secret testing, experimental weapons, an incident that could not be explained to the public. Considering the time period, this idea was not entirely unrealistic, but there is no confirmation, only possibility. Over the years, many have tried to explain what happened. One theory involves a natural phenomenon, a specific wind pattern known as the Kármán vortex. Under certain conditions, this can create low-frequency sound waves, infrasound. These waves are not always heard, but they can be felt. They can affect the human brain, triggering anxiety, fear, disorientation, even hallucinations. According to this theory, the hikers may not have seen something. They may have felt it, an overwhelming, unexplainable fear, strong enough to force them to cut open their tent and flee. There is also a medical explanation. In extreme cold, the human body can begin to fail. When hypothermia sets in, the brain can misfire. It creates an illusion, a sensation of intense heat. People may feel as if they are burning, and in response they remove their clothes. This is known as paradoxical undressing. This could explain why some of them were found without proper clothing. But even these explanations do not answer everything. Their injuries, the radiation, the strange condition of the bodies, too many pieces still do not fit. In the end, the authorities released their conclusion. The hikers had died due to a powerful natural force, a statement that sounds definitive, but explains nothing. It does not explain why they cut open the tent from the inside, why they left without shoes, why they moved so slowly in freezing conditions, why their injuries were so unusual, why radiation was present. It does not answer any of the real questions. It simply ends the investigation and leaves everything else behind. That night they felt something strong enough to make them tear open their tent and walk into the cold, barefoot, in the dark. They did not run. They did not scatter in panic. They moved together, slowly, and none of them survived. So, what did they encounter? Was it just the storm, or something we still do not understand? What makes this case so unsettling is not just how it ended, but how it happened. They did not lose control completely. They did not abandon each other. Even in fear, they stayed connected. They tried to endure. Which leads to one final question. Were they running away from something? Or were they following something into the darkness? That night on that mountain, what really happened? And even now, the answer is still waiting. If this story left you wondering, the next one is waiting for you. Subscribe and stay with us.